you cannot be a decent human being and support the Palestinians in their war on Israel. I've said this before. It was true before October 7th. It is undeniably true after October 7th. But when you look at the Palestinian propaganda machine, it often does target the decency within humans, and a big part of it is by spreading lies. Now, some of these lies, it wouldn't matter if they were the truth. Some of them, it does matter. They play on some of the good values in the West and some of the unfortunately bad values that are becoming more and more the prominent philosophy in Western culture. So we've talked about many of the lies of the pro-Palestinian side on this channel. We wanted to do a video where we talk about many of them in one episode, uh, some that we've talked about, some that we haven't talked about. And so that let's get to it. Welcome to the reality show, day 200 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by Marco, Richard, and Jonathan. Let's go straight to the start. I don't know if it's necessarily the start chronologically, but it is the start of what we're going to go through, which is this idea around the Nakba, what the pro-Palestinian side, or just generally people who hate Israel, call the Nakba, which is Arabic for disaster. That is the founding of the state of Israel. So Israel was founded after the UN partition plan was approved in November of 1947, approved as in most countries voted for it. The United Kingdom, it's always worth mentioning on the Ayn Rand Center UK, abstained. Yeah, they couldn't make up their mind. The partition plan gave the Jews a state, and it created an Arab state, one of many. The Jews celebrated the fact that they were going to have their own state finally after many after the Zionist movement had been around for about half a century, and after, of course, the Holocaust had ended a couple of years earlier. They accepted the partition plan. The Arabs did not. Israel declared independence in May of 1948. The next morning, Arab armies of I think 7 armies were involved in the attacked Israel. Nobody came to Israel's aid, by the way, and Israel. It was assumed, I think, in the world that Israel will lose the war, obviously, and cease to exist shortly thereafter. That is not what happened. By the way, many of the Arabs who were going to live in the future Israeli state took up arms against Israel. So some of them decided when they saw that their side is losing to flee because they were worried of the consequences. The consequences, by the way, being it's better to be an Arab in Israel than anywhere else in the Middle East. But that's a story for another day. So they fled after their war was unsuccessful. And territorially, Israel was bigger than it would have been under the partition plan, and some of the Arab lands that would have been a part of the Arab state, the new Arab state, were absorbed by other Arab countries. So one of the things we hear about in that context is the whole refugee crisis that was created. How we'll get to refugees, which is a whole different thing when it comes to Palestinians as when it comes to anybody else. But we hear about people having to leave their homes. What we don't hear in this context is the Jews who had to leave their homes from Arab countries, not because they started a war against their own country, the Arab country where they lived and were born and raised, a war in which they tried to eliminate that country off the map, but because they were Jews. That was the reason why they were kicked out. This is you don't hear this in this protest. Sorry, there is some construction going on here in the office. You don't hear that in the protests, but you do hear about the Jews. I'm going to pass it along to somebody else in the hope that the construction will end by the time we get back to me. Jonathan, you live in Israel. You are on occupied land, according to some.
Yeah. Well, this land that I'm currently on was completely empty until the Jews came. So I don't know if this, I guess it also counts as occupied land. I know Sheikh Munis was a village in northern Tel Aviv, so maybe that's occupied. But where I'm at now was a desert until the 20s. Tel Aviv. So just this part. Now the Nakba issue um, is a complex issue. You know, it was war. There were many different things happening in different places. So the orders that the citizens got was, you know, we're coming, you'll just be clearing the way so the militaries can advance and destroy the new Jewish country. So a lot of these villagers, they left their houses to clear the room for the Egyptians, for the Syrians, the Jordanians, all these military forces who came in the race to Tel Aviv. That was the plan. The Egyptians, they wanted to reach Tel Aviv within a week. They were stopped around Ashdod, which is south of Tel Aviv, about probably 80 kilometers, something like that. So yeah, they told the Palestinians to move away. Now there were instances. This was a long conflict, right? This was more than a year. So there were instances where the Jewish armed groups, it was even before there was an IDF, when the war started, was various different Jewish fighting groups, predominantly the Haganah or Palmach, and they evacuated a lot of villages when it was needed for military purposes. Um, there were, but most of the cases were indeed of the Arabs just leaving. They were also scared. A lot of them were not under any orders. They were just scared that the Jews would do harmful things to them or whatever other concerns. They didn't want to live under the Jews. There were a lot of reasons. But to call it a Nakba, to call it a great disaster, a great tragedy, um, and to put the blame on the Jews is in a sense it is also a case for what they were trying to do is also in a bit Holocaust denial, because every time they would mention the horrible things that the Jews have been through, they would mention the Nakba on the same hand, as if the two are any they have any comparison possible between them. So there was nothing that has anything to do with genocide in that respect. It was just a war and something that happens as a part of a war. It was a war that was initiated by those Arabs, and they suffer the consequences of what happens when you initiate an aggressive war on a newly founded country of actual refugees, by the way, who fled from Europe. All the Jews who came to Israel are refugees. My family, they came from Europe, even some of them from Northern Africa. And we don't go, I don't go back to Germany. I don't go to Frankfurt and ask where is my grandfather's flat. You know, I don't do that because I understand that this was a long time ago, and the people in Frankfurt now have nothing to do with it, and I have nothing to do with it. So I just go on with my life. So this is, I think, Razi, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to briefly, because before I go to Richard and Marco, so Carla mentions here the argument I most often get is that the fact that Jews, no, actually, no, this is not the one I wanted to read. A different one by Carla was everyone focuses on those who left, but no one talks about the ones that stayed. And when you tell them about the Jews that had to leave Arab countries, they say, well, now they have a state. Yes, and ironically, the same people also say that those Jews should go back to where they came from, which in some cases is the countries, the Western countries where we hear of the protests that are going on now. In other cases, there are Arab countries where they will be slaughtered as soon as they slip.
Also, Razi, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of these Arab villages, it is a tragedy in a sense of this is what their leaders, brought upon them. You know, it's their war. They started the war. A lot of, you can't blame the average farmer, in this village or that on the whole thing. They're just living, a lot of them, it was just living their lives, and this was brought upon them. So, for that perspective, it is indeed a tragedy that happened to them. but their responsibility, the instigators of this so-called tragedy, is not the Israelis, but their own leadership. That's who they should go after, not us.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for the super chat. Richard.
Okay. Well, I want to say, well, what is the real Nakba? Is it the fact that the Arab nations sided with Hitler and lost the Second World War? Is it the fact that Israel was formed as a state in the first place? Is that not the real catastrophe when viewed from the Arab Muslim perspective over there? Is it not the fact that the UN were facilitating it, the UN, which they call to as the arbiters of fairness today, which is its own house of lies, but that it was put in place by an international body? And what about the fact, the word itself, the fact that it ends up coming to mean everything that people want it to mean and no detail whatsoever? So you ended up with a single word which you can say, which basically means that the Jews oppressed us back in time. We don't know how, we don't know why, but it was a disaster. And that cements the foundation of our victimhood from then onwards. And that word can also be taught to the second group of people which are relevant in this whole picture, which is the Western apologists, the useful idiots outside of the Middle East. And throughout all of these lies that we're going to be looking at, there is always two groups involved. There is the Gazans and the Palestinians and the Arabs in the Middle East. And there are those university students, Western groups, commentators in the UK. And often it's a contradictory message to each of them. And one of the things that's often used is language. And one of the ways that language is often used is a foreign language that can mean one thing one way and one thing another, and can be vague to anybody who doesn't need to know more than which group to hate.
Yeah, this situation, the propaganda on the Palestinian side, as by necessity, has to use lots of lies, because they haven't got a rational argument to stand up in favor of the claims that they're making. We are analyzing lies. I mean, even Pinocchio would have an issue with all the lies that have been bandied about. But what is a lie in the first place? A lie is a statement that once you, especially if it's a complex statement, once you break it down, doesn't have a correlation with reality. So it doesn't represent the facts of reality. Going back in time and making an argument that because 76 years ago this fact happened, now I'm going and murder a couple of Jews at a rock concert, it's just an excuse to effectively detach your responsibility, your choices from the ideas that make you take those choices. So effectively, you're justifying your violence, your actions, just talking about a buried past and trying to shape the argument to your advantage. But the biggest lie of all, if you want to go down the route, is Palestine and Palestinian. Because in 1948, the words didn't even exist. They were invented to represent this group of people, this Arab population left around after the creation of Israel. They were invented about 20 years later. So after the First War, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, was defeated, and the land was conquered by the conquerors, by the victors of the war, and then it was disposed according to agreements among winning countries. So to go back to a particular point in time and decide from now on this is the truth, and ignoring totally what's happened in the past, is just used to obfuscate, to hide what the actions of today are, and why the action today are taken. So yes, you can make the argument 1948 the UN allowed the state of Israel to be created and blah 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 blah, but how far back do we have to go before we realize actually those areas were never a state? It's not like the creation of Israel has destroyed an existing state. So all these lies and all these manipulation, suggestions, omissions, are just created effectively again to hide the real motive behind today's actions.
And without risking messing up the order here, I just want to point out that when people go and say you can't go back to one point in time and then argue you can't go back to October the 7th and that that's somehow the same, it's not. We're talking about people who the perpetrators of which were alive now, the ideology of which is alive now, the supporters of it, the funders of it are alive now, and those are the people that could be punished for their murderous actions now. So those two aren't comparable at all.
Yeah, and that ties into knows too much. Their super chat. Thank you, Stefan, as well. Thank you, knows too much. Knows too much. Says founding father of Palestinians, Amin al-Husseini, was an Islamo-Nazi SS general who met Hitler and incited for the genocide of Jews even before the Nazi. The SS general part is not a fact as far as I know, but yeah, he was. He did meet with Hitler. He was very much on the same page as Hitler when it came to Jews. And again, that is not a reason to have an issue with anybody in Gaza at the moment. The reason to have an issue with people in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria on the west bank of the Jordan River is because of their current culture and the fact that they actually went along with it. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat.
Also, Razi, I think the rank, Amin al-Husseini, he got an honorary rank in the SS for getting Bosnian volunteers to join the ranks of the SS. I think that's the...
Okay, all right. But he wasn't leading any troops into battle.
No, it was getting them more troops to battle. Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks for the correction. Yeah, so the next point I was going to talk about, there is some tie into this, but we are kind of speeding ahead. By the way, we can't get through all the lies in 1 hour. We'll get through as many of the main ones as we can. And this is something that you hear argued by the so-called moderates, the people who just want a peaceful two-state solution and so on, and that is that the settlements are an obstacle to peace. And it varies from either the main obstacle to peace to one of the main obstacles alongside terrorism. The settlements, just to clarify, it refer to Israeli towns and villages at the moment in Judea and Samaria. There used to be some in Gaza as well. Judea and Samaria in the part that Israel and territories that Israel won in the war in 1967, and that, according to those who argue for the two-state solution, will be a part of the future Palestinian state. Now, I've told this before, my personal anecdote here, which was as a teenager in Israel, a left-wing teenager who said, yeah, we want peace, let's give them what they want and have a two-state solution. This was the issue that moved me away from the left. I couldn't understand this idea that a two-state solution means a Jewish state and a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security, being BFFs. But for this to happen, the Palestinian state has to be free of any Jews. That always didn't sit well with me, and it still doesn't sit well with me any more than it did when I was 17. Again, lands, and one of the ways you hear this, mostly from the less moderate people, is it's stolen land. And this idea, first of all, is collectivist in the sense that the Palestinian people have a right to all the land, and then if you settle somewhere against without their approval, then it is stolen land. And it's the very fact that it is somebody who's Jewish makes it stolen. So that land can be settled, but not by a Jew. And part of it, we argued a couple of times with trolls here who talked about stolen land, and we pointed out, if a Jewish person or any other person actually steals land that actually belongs to an individual, which is how ownership and property works, then in Israel, they will get in trouble with the law and be removed from that land. So that's in broadly speaking, this idea of the settlements as an obstacle to peace and land being stolen. Jonathan.
Yes. Also, I would add the whole settler violence myth, which are also a big part of this whole story. But yeah, there are many examples of settlements being evacuated in Israel because it has been proven that they have been set up on illegally obtained land. So there are cases, and unfortunately, we have these kinds of people in Israel who are religious fanatics, and they really think they have a sacred mission to go and settle the Holy Land, and they go to these places without permits, without purchasing the land legally, whatever. They start their settlements, and that's a known issue. And the difference is that Israel is a Western country that has that does protect individual rights. So there are legal battles over this. It is unfortunate that such things happen, but usually it's being dealt with. There are borderline cases, there are more complicated cases, but this is not a fundamental pattern, that shows you that the way Israel operates is we go and we steal the poor Palestinian land. You don't see that. If you have, and there are lots of videos of, IDF bulldozers destroying Israeli settlements. So why do they do that if Israel is all about stealing the Arab land? It's clearly, we have a lot of issues with such instances. So it doesn't hold true. And I would add that something that is even more vicious is that the claim that I hear a lot, I heard it recently by a professor that I used to respect, that the settlers, they go to Palestinian villages, they go to their olive tree plantations, and they shoot them, they kill them. They are murderers, all these settlers. And this couldn't be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is that every week you have terror attacks by the Palestinians in the West Bank against those settlers. There have been many recent terrorist strikes on border crossings, in Jerusalem there we had one that was fatal. But every day they throw rocks, they fight, they fight against the settlers. So to put it upside down like that, I think is equal to modern day elders of Zion. This story that you have these Jews who are coming from, and they control the land, and they are killing these poor shepherds. That is really outrageous claim. And I've been hearing it a lot on BBC stuff and these professors. So I think it's something we should also make sure we explain. Yeah.
And of course, who killed Shepherd recently? The 14-year-old Shepherd. It wasn't the Jews, was it? It was the Palestinians. And it's an example of the inversion that's always taking place. And I think when it comes to the so-called settler violence, and I'm loath to use the terms that are part of the lies in many ways because they give it undue credence. But to stick with it for a second, it is a massive distraction. It's an attempt to distract from all of the violence perpetrated on October the 7th, all of the rapes and murders, etc., and to say, okay, we need to balance things up somehow. We need to find some Jews, some individual civilian Jews that we can claim have done some bad things, and therefore claim some moral equivalency across the two, and claim that it's just two sides and they're both equal in terms of morality. So
I've heard it being used when I was talking about the evils of October 7th, about the horrors that the settlers are doing to the West Bank, as if the two things are comparable. Really outrageous.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, I don't want to wish to stray into the topic on occupation quite yet, but obviously the disengagement from Gaza is an example of the absolute opposite of occupying land.
So thank you, P. Eddie, for becoming a YouTube member. Good timing as well, because right after this show is the last session of the Fountainhead book club. I believe it's like the 10th last session, but if you've read the Fountainhead, you'll know that it's not a book you want to put down, and it's not a book you want to stop talking about. So it is okay, Daniel corrects me that it's only the 4th last session, but in any case, yeah, it's the last session, and something very interesting is gonna come right after it, or not right after it, but in a few weeks. So thanks again for becoming a member. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Thank you, Knows Too Much. Knows Too Much says, most Palestinians who left in 48 did so, 1, following the pan-Arabist leaders, 2, by their own will, 3, due to taking part in the war against Israel. Yes, but it's much better if you say they're refugees who were kicked out by the evil Jews and have been living in misery in Jordan or Michigan or wherever it is that they currently reside. It paints a much better story, and it makes it much easier to sympathize with them. Thank you, Benjamin, for the super chat. Benjamin says, thank you for your consistent commentary. It's sad to see that you guys had to do it for 200 days now. I hope you won't have to do it for much longer. Me too. I'm not optimistic that we won't. I keep saying, we can't wait to go back to making fun of environmentalists who tell us to save the planet by not flushing the toilet. But as soon as we can, we will go back to that. But unfortunately, we still have to talk about this. And so yeah, we are we is oh actually there is one more thing about settler violence, which is a thing that we also mentioned on this channel many times is there's documentation of settlers attacking Palestinians. There's video of it. And a big part of why there's video of it is because B'Tselem, an anti-Israel Israeli organization, about a decade ago, had this major campaign that they were very proud of, where they gave cameras to Palestinians to document violence by settlers against them. Now, if that is what you are clearly being told, here, take a camera, show the world, so the world will be with you in your war against the Jews, it is not difficult to make such things happen. Some people, if you attack them, they will respond, and you can attack them, then press record, then they respond, and then you have documentation of violence against you. Now, this is not to say that there is no such thing as settlers going out to attack Palestinians, but this is a major phenomenon. Is not a major phenomenon. The major phenomenon in the West Bank is Palestinian terrorism, not Jewish terrorism. That's a daily occurrence. It's not always successful, and it's not reported with the same glee that any attack on Palestinians by settlers is reported by, because that fits the narrative that we are supposed to buy into. So that is the important news that comes out of there.
Never say anything against the Palestinian terrorism. Notice really how upside down this is, Razi. We've both grown up here in Israel. We've always been scared of terrorism, whenever we're in public spaces. I'm sure you think, oh, what a great terror attack could happen here. This is a thought that every Israeli has been growing up with, because this is our reality. It is not the reality of the people of Hebron. Their reality, although how sorrow their economic situation, is that they throw stones at the Israeli troops. They are the ones who attack, or at least the attacks come from. So think. I'm trying to think. What do you think? It's anti-Semitism to an extent, Razi, to put this blame also on us, that the Jews are being attacked? The whole reversal of the story.
I think the overall focus on Israel as what is wrong in the world has very rarely doesn't have anti-Semitic elements in it. Let me put it in that way. People who this is their cause. In of all the causes they can choose, this is their cause. It's that one state in the Middle East that is somewhat rights respecting, is surrounded by savages who want nothing more than to kill all the people in that country. If that is what you see in the world as a problem, it would be either motivated by anti-Semitism or it is motivated by hatred of the good, what Ayn Rand called hatred of the good for being the good, but would, I think, include eventually, if not at the starting point, eventually will include hatred of Jews, as a collective. So yeah, that's how I see it. All right, the occupation. So there's a lot of aspects to what's wrong with the idea of the occupation, and the Palestinians are fighting against occupation and so on. First of all, one of the thing is the idea is that Israel is occupying Palestine as if there was a country. Israel took it over, and now it is under occupation. That of course didn't happen. Israel in 1967 was once again forced into war by its Arab neighbors, won that war easily, won some territories, among them the Gaza Strip, which was held by Egypt, Judea and Samaria and the West Bank of the Jordan River held by Jordan, and held on to these territories again with the offer of giving them back or giving them to whomever in exchange for peace, which was pretty much there all along and was rejected always because as part of that, the other side would have to recognize Israel and say that it is a legitimate country and not plan armed conflict against it. But there's different aspects to which this is a lie. One is, even to the extent that according to international law, whatever that means, Judea and Samaria is under occupation. They are not under occupation in the sense that Arab communities are self-governing, self-controlling. They are not, the IDF does not have a presence there, and I think that's a problem, by the way, but that is factually not the way things are at the moment. There are some Jewish towns and villages, the settlements, and that is maybe the extent to which there's an occupation there. And of course, in Gaza, there has not been an occupation since 2005. Israel's civilian population and its military were removed from it, and there is no occupation. So October 7th was not a response to the occupation, and we can talk about that in the context of the new version of how Gaza is referred to. But Jonathan, your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting issue. I'm trying to myself think whether or not the concept of occupation, even if it's true, is it in and of itself a negative or a positive? But regardless, the fact is that unfortunately the Rabin government, since the Oslo Accord, has left the vast majority of the population centers in the West Bank to be entirely self-governed. Of course, with Gaza, we have completely left Gaza, so there was unfortunately again no military presence in Gaza. So much for occupation. Now, I think the core of the issue that shows you that there is some kind of occupation is the lack of freedom of movement. That the Palestinian cannot go to Tel Aviv, without a work permit or whatever. Now the same applies to Amman, by the way. They need a visa. They need or the same applies to a citizen of Bangladesh who wants to fly to the United States. He needs to apply for a visa and all that. So there are similar restrictions, I think, between different countries all over the world. We don't have free borders. I don't think there's something too unusual about this case of having not free borders. Now, is it ideal? No, I think Israel should have ended the occupation a long time ago and annexing the entire region. Now, the reason that there is occupation is because there was an intifada. There was another intifada. There were various wars that led the government of Israel to have to build a wall and have constant military presence there because of the danger that it permitted to come to Israel. So because they attacked the Jews and caused the devastation that they have caused, that is why their freedom of movement is restricted. But again, this is the same case in many places around the world. So I don't see why the world isn't outraged that people of many different countries, they don't have the ability to enter other countries. I don't see anyone outraged by that. So this unique outrage with this so-called occupation is also, I think, revealing of the psychological motives of those who use those accusations. Razi, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say the idea that if Israel ended the occupation by annexing the territories, this would still be called an occupation. If you've ever had the pleasure of watching Al Jazeera reporting from Jerusalem, they report and it says from occupied East Jerusalem. Yeah, and of course the Golan Heights. You know, the international community considers East Jerusalem, which has been annexed by Israel, and the Golan Heights, which have been annexed by Israel, and the people who were living there who were previously Syrians are now Israeli citizens. That is still considered occupied territories.
But again, the people of the West Bank, it's not that they don't have citizenship. They have a passport. They have a Palestinian passport. It's just a really terrible passport that doesn't get you entrance anywhere because it's a terrible country. So the criticism should come if I'm a Palestinian now, you know, in my 20s, I was born there. I didn't choose that, but I want to go to Europe, you know. I would blame my government for being so terrible in the international relationship, whatever, for having me this terrible passport. So the whole I think framing of this is completely upside down. It's always the Israelis are responsible, and not the Palestinians' own terrible self-governing, which is the result for their lack of freedom of movement.
Yeah, and the whole framing being completely upside down is the whole point of the pro-Palestinian side. Richard.
I think from a Western perspective, at least for many of the useful idiots in the West, they don't have any of the detail of the regional history, conflict, even the areas where they are now. So occupation for them applies equally to Gaza. So 1 second, you know, they're talking about there being 2 million Palestinians in Gaza crammed in like sardines, and the next minute it's supposedly occupied. They talk about the fact that it's Israel that supplies the water and the electricity, and at the same time, suddenly they don't. You know, the idea is that they have nothing, and they're suffering in some isolated area of land. It's just ludicrous.
Yeah, occupation is used as a big package deal, really, with the meaning. When they say occupation, they mean military occupation. They equate occupation, which is like a spatial relationship of two bodies. They equate it with invasion, and that's why it fits so well in today's narrative where we are so against colonialism and imperialism and all this kind of bad things that we did in the past. All this pesky West spreading rule of law and civilization across the world, you know. But the same people here in the West who decry occupation of Israel, of Palestine, again, what the hell is Palestine? Managed to fit in the head, managed to not to find a dissonance between their belief that Russia is occupying Ukraine or that Turkey is occupying Cyprus. They can cope with that, but when it comes to Israel and Palestine, Palestine is occupied. This is kind of dissonance and total flexibility that concept seems to have among certain people who don't use their minds.
Thank you, Knows Too Much, for another super chat. Knows Too Much says Palestinian refugee received a special definition for someone living as little as a few years in the land before 48, not generations like actual refugee. Yeah, and it also means somebody who could be a descendant of Palestinian refugees, which is also unique to the Palestinians. Usually you are a refugee if you actually had to flee an area for whatever reason. The following generations do not. I still wonder, one of the things I often disagree with many on the pro-Israel, many Jews on the pro-Israel side is this idea that, God gave us the land. We were there 2,000 years ago. That's one. None of you were there 2,000 years ago. But look, if Palestinian refugee can go back generations, why not? Find your ancestry going back to 2,000 plus years ago and make that claim as well.
Also on the occupation, Razi, I think it's important to mention that this entire situation is very far from ideal, and a lot of the blame is on the Israeli side. The fact that the Israeli leadership has failed to put the conflict to an end and reach a conclusion, of actually deciding what are we going to do, and not staying in this status quo stage, which is kind of in the middle, or even on the side to losing the war. That is the core of a lot of these troubles that we're Israel is being accused of. So I think it's also worth mentioning that Israel's leadership has been incompetent in solving this conflict for decades. So all of that is just because of that, fundamentally, I think.
And it's not just militarily, it's also, as you see the propaganda spreading across the world, they should have fought back on the same level of propaganda, to fight back propaganda, fight back the misinformation. But if you just let it get away with it, then people start believing their own hype and start believing their own lies.
Yeah, that language of occupation has clearly gone from, is it not contained by Al Jazeera, is it? It's within the BBC, it's within the New York Times, it's within the framing of the whole attitude to the region.
Yeah, Al Jazeera.
It is Israel's weakness that is enabling this to endure. It only flourishes because Israel is weak. Is weak in the West Bank and in Gaza. If Israel was strong, even in 1967, and long before there was any Al Jazeera and all of that, we would have been living in a completely different reality. Same applies to Israel's response to October 7th. So as an Israeli citizen, I think it's very fair to me to put the blame on the Israelis, because this is my government, and I pay, my taxes go to the Israeli government. They are responsible for this. Of course, the entire Western media propaganda in Al Jazeera is horrendous, and the Palestinians are awful. But fundamentally, we are the ones who had the power to resolve it, and we refused to resolve it. So.
Yeah, Israel lacks the moral clarity to act militarily against its enemies. It also lacks the moral clarity to say, for example, to a channel like Al Jazeera, which is a propaganda. This is not a free speech thing where they're, just opposing Israel's policies as a citizen. This is a propaganda network of a totalitarian regime. Their only presence in Israel is to create propaganda, on the ground propaganda against Israel, with the goal of Israel no longer existing. Why this is allowed, I don't know. Knows too much, so maybe he does know that as well, but he does know the following. Thank you again for the super chat. He says most Palestinians are invaders, migrants from surrounding lands and farther places, many from recent centuries. Palestinianism is a tool for Islamic imperialism. Yeah, there is the fact that, once the Zionist movement started settling the land, Arabs from neighboring areas, I don't know how many of them were countries at the time, were sent. But that's a non-issue. If they came to that area and decided to create the free state of Palestine, not free in the sense of the people chanting, but free as in a laissez-faire capitalist society, and called it Palestine, great. That would be a wonderful thing. That is, of course, not the case, and it is very
It wouldn't even be a mixed economy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, mixed economy would be a step forward for many of those countries, although it's a step forward that will probably be temporary before another step backward. Richard, we didn't touch on the open-air prison idea, right? Which is kind of adjacent, occupation adjacent. Do you want to talk about that a little bit.
It is, because in terms of what we're talking about earlier of Israel being weak, this to me strikes at the core of it, because this touches on the altruism and the apologism of Israel all the time. I mean, if you take what I referred to earlier about like the water supply and the electricity supply and the free electricity and water to the region, it's always the fact that that there's no recognition of everything that Israel does that is altruistic. That's always banked and then forgotten and then ignored, and then more is demanded of the person sacrificing, of the group sacrificing, and they are accused of oppressing you or of victimizing you, of causing your suffering, because they won't do even more for you. That's the inversion that takes place. And when it comes to the open air prison, for a start, it's an open air prison with an enormous gap in it, because there's Egypt at the bottom. Now, Egypt mans one border of it, and it's never concentrated on the fact that all the other Arab states, which could provide accommodation or assistance to the Palestinians, choose not to, and choose to ensure that it remains separate. And of course, the Egyptians don't want to manage Gaza anymore either. So that's why they contain the border. So but to a Western audience, they would honestly believe that it's Israel that surrounds Gaza on all sides, including the sea, with a blockade, and therefore that it's literally an open air prison. And yet, when you look at the photographs of thriving markets, of thriving life, of life on the beach taking place in Gaza throughout the period, it's ludicrous that you look at the hospitals that Israel has helped fund and expand within the Gaza Strip. You've seen the MRI machines and the equipment that's within there. And I'm not talking at this moment about all the other equipment, the weaponry, the tunnels underneath and all that. I'm talking about the stuff that makes it clearly not an open air prison. When Gazans can go to Israeli hospitals, even in Israel, for certain treatments, and people in the West Bank get treatments for like Sinwar himself with his treatments in Israel, then clearly you're demonstrating all the time that it's an open air prison that isn't a prison. It's not bordered. It's leaky. It's a territory that people control themselves. And if it's frankly a shithole, it's their own fault.
Yeah, it's a prison in a sense that it's full of criminals, full of terrorists and terrorist enabler. So under the point of view, it's not far off. But if you say it's a prison because people are forced to stay in there, well, they had their own government for starters. Hamas is the government of Gaza. So how many prisons can decide to declare war to another country, as Hamas did? And the facility, the ease of Gazan to go into Israel to work at their choice. They weren't enslaved. They chose to go into Israel day in, day out, but they were allowed to do it. Just look how many people often on Twitter talk about, oh, my relative from Gaza here, just take a break from the slaughter. It's like, really? I mean, can you do that in a prison? And just look at the relatives of the Scottish First Minister. They were coming and going as they liked. They chose to be there. They could have been in Scotland with their family, couldn't they? But it's again, take two words that sound really scary, put them together, and just point at Israel and pretend that's where it comes from.
And of course, the biggest problem: let David Cameron repeat them, give them the authenticity of a Western voice, and therefore cement them within the mind as being impartial and legitimate when they're not.
Yeah, I want to second what Jeanette is saying in the chat. If you like this episode, if you like this content, hit the like button. That is a free way to support us, and it does support us, as do comments. I see there are many comments, so I can't actually read all of them, but that's a good thing. If you're watching this not live, you can also comment Just tell us that you liked it or didn't like it, or tell us why. And yeah, more people will see this. We're almost done. We have like 10 more minutes left, and we didn't get anywhere near through every lie the Palestinians put out there. I do want to mention that I saw some conversation in the chat about Lebanon, which used to be a much nicer country from what I've heard. I've never been, but much nicer than it is now. The ideas, bad ideas create bad societies. And the more they're taken seriously, the worse the society. And in Gaza, the ideas of Islam are taken very seriously. In Lebanon, they're taken more and more seriously, and are kind of overpowering any less serious consideration that they had before. And yeah, it is very much scientifically, the more you follow bad ideas consistently, such as Islam, the worse your country. Jonathan, anything about open air prisons or the open air prison that Gaza supposedly?
I think Marco couldn't have said it better with that it's full of prisoners. But no, let's take the next
Yeah,
slide.
and with the open air prison, I don't know if there is, but there definitely should be a get out of jail free card for everyone, not through Israel, but if they want to sail away, I would encourage that,
Absolutely,
and I think
absolutely.
Israel should encourage that. All right. Yeah, so the next thing we were going to go to, well, actually, a couple of things we talked about, but I see this happen. I see this again, and we talked about this yesterday on the Daily Objective when we talked about UNRWA. The idea that Israel is starving the Palestinians in Gaza at the moment, which, of course, I like to talk about it in two parts. One is Hamas attacked on October 7th, took hostages. Part of Israel's war effort should involve stopping food and medicine from going into Gaza. They want food, they should release the hostages and lay down their arms. That is a way in which the people you attacked could consider letting you live. That's point A. But point B, which is unfortunate, but Israel is allowing more aid to go into Gaza than went in before the terrorist attacks. So Israel is actually rewarding the people of Gaza for October 7th. And when we hear of starvation, first of all, wherever Israel is in control, which is not most of Gaza, and is actually, in terms of the population, the minority, a very small minority, I think, relatively, is in areas controlled by Israel, aid gets distributed without a problem. Where Hamas is in control, Hamas controls the aid. The aid goes to Hamas. The terrorists that are still fighting to kill Jews are well fed. Don't worry about them.
Be fat as well, I would say.
Yeah, some of them are no. Well, I don't know. They're probably training as well. But the terrorists are well fed, and the population is fed to the extent that Hamas wants them fed. And Hamas, I've said in the past, I think the only thing they love more than dead Israelis is dead Palestinians, especially dead women and children, because that is something that they can then tell the world, look, here are Palestinians starving and dying. Yeah, this is what they're doing now. Where they can, they starve Palestinians, and then the world tells us that it is Israel's doing.
Mhm.
Jonathan.
Yeah, well, I first of all, I don't really believe that there's mass starvation there. I actually believe they have now a lot of food and they know what to do with the amount of aid that they're getting from all over the world right now. The fact that there are people starving is not a claim against Israel because Israel hasn't instigated the war. Also the fact that there's starvation all over the world. Why are Palestinians are the only ones that aren't allowed to starve? They don't care about people starving in Africa, people starving in I don't know, even in China, there are people starving probably. There are people who are starving in North Korea, people who are starving in a lot of bad places around the world, but you don't see the US especially caring so deeply about it, actually going out of their way to build a port, to land food there, and the Israeli troops need to protect them to doing that. You don't see them do that in other places where there's starvation. So I don't really think they're about protecting people of the world from starvation. I think they want to make the life harder for the Israelis. They want to play along with the Palestinian propaganda. And again, the Israelis are weak for allowing this entire thing to happen. I think any plane that is coming to drop these supplies should be shut down. That's why I think this is a no-flight zone. This is a war. Why do you have planes dropping supplies there? It's a violation of closed airspace. That's why I think we should handle this. And
well, it's not closed. Israel allows it.
That's the problem. That's the problem. So they might as well starve. People of October 7th, they had much worse deaths than starvation, much worse, and they didn't have any sympathy to them. So I don't have any sympathy to the Gazans who are starving.
So since we only have less than 2 minutes left, Richard, I don't know if you want to touch on the women and children issue or on this pick either.
Just in starvation, you have to be careful about how it's used all the time. The context is often dropped. I mean, you're led to believe that there's food poverty and starvation in UK schools, with kids turning up unable to eat. So it's an abused term all over the place. Also, some of the imagery that's used, sometimes they show an emaciated child, rarely, but an emaciated child that's actually suffering a disease. Suffering some hideous disease, and they're used to as if they represent somebody who's being starved of food, when all around them clearly others are not. And of course you've got to look at the Hamas sitting on the top of trucks with their guns, controlling the food and where it goes, and then of course the food being turned into financing for Hamas as it's provided free, sold back to Gazans, and then the money is used to buy weaponry from Iran.
Yeah, starvation is the hallmark of dictatorship. Only a state can starve their own people, because if people are hungry, they will trade with each other if they're free to do so.
Thank you, Knows Too Much, for the last minute super chat and for all your super chats throughout the show. Knows Too Much says the U.S. aid bill includes $9 billion humanitarian aid, and the scare quotes around humanitarian remind me of another myth that people like to repeat. Yeah, there is no humanitarian aid in war. It is military aid. Military aid doesn't have to be weapons. It could be the calories the fighters need in order to be able to lift and use those weapons. Yeah. Okay, the Fountainhead Book Club starts in less than a minute. So very quickly, Jonathan, where can people find you?
Our dear viewers can find me on Substack, philosophyIneeded.com, link in the description.
Marco, Richard?
Briefly Objective channel, sister of ARCUK. Very short content. Share, watch. It's all there.
I'm Razi Ginzberg on X. Thanks everybody for watching. Members, YouTube members, Fountainhead Book Club. Last session starts now. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow.